the Asia Pacific, and good morning everybody in the Americas. And we'd like to welcome you today to our second webinar that we are hosting this bright sunny afternoon in Geneva on the issue of localization. Today we have over 140 people registered for this session from 40 different countries across Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, Europe, Asia, the Pacific, and with a very high proportion from the field. So we're very much looking forward to the discussion on this incredibly important topic. My name is Ingrid McDonald, and I'm a director with the Senior Transformative Agenda Implementation Team, otherwise known as the STATE. Today we are focusing on localization and what this means in practice, what it means concretely in the field to actually take forward this very important area. The reason why we're focusing on this is, as an organizer, as a body, the state has undertaken 14 different missions, including operational peer reviews, where we have identified a number of very good practices from the field perspective, but also where we've found that many practitioners are still struggling with how to make localization a reality and move beyond the implementing partner relationship to the equal and strategic role of having local actors involved in collective decision making and processes and at the front line of response as well as at the leadership level. Also, one of the key areas is from some of the high-level policy areas such as the Grand Bargain. We've seen ambitious agendas set with targets such as 25% being committed of funding to local and national actors. Some of the questions that have come up through our missions is, what does this mean in reality? What things will change? What things need to change? Will this make a difference for us in the field? And so today we would like to bring forward some very tangible experience from the field which could hopefully add to the exchange of good practice across all of us, but also to help elaborate some of these broader policy areas. Just some administrative details before we begin. The webinar will have two parts. The first 30 to 40 minutes will be focused on some questions that we will ask our three speakers today. Then we will open up to your questions from the audience. I would encourage you to use the question and answer function as well as the chat function, which you will find in the right-hand corner of your screen. You can chat with each other, but you can also send questions and answers to us as the moderators as well as directly to the speakers, and we will endeavour to ensure that those answers are put to the speakers both orally but also through the chat. I would also like to encourage you to have a look at the poll which is opened. There is a poll on your bottom right-hand corner. This poll will provide us with very valuable information that we can use to improve these webinars as we move forward. As you know, we have these every month, and your feedback is essential to improving the quality and the relevance. I would also ask you to please refrain from changing the mute function on your speakers. It's very important that you keep the mute function on at all time so that we can hear the speakers and not have background noise. I'd also like to, just to recap on this morning, we did have a webinar this morning, and there was a very interactive and useful discussion. So some of the issues that came up there, we may also try and bring some of those questions forward today. We'll see how we go. Now, just to start with introducing the speakers, we are very privileged today to have three eminent speakers. They come from different perspectives, but very complementary perspectives. We have Dr. Gwendolyn Pang. She is the head of the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Society's Country Cluster Support Team based in Beijing. Dr. Pang has also been, until recently, the Secretary General of the Filipino Red Cross. She has been an active leader in addressing some of the biggest emergencies that have been faced by the humanitarian community. She's also been a recipient of various awards, including the Florence Nightingale Award, and we're really privileged to have her here today. We also have Jamie Ibista. Jamie is the Humanitarian Coordinator and First Assistant Secretary, Humanitarian Division of Foreign Affairs and Trade with the Australian Government. Jamie has a long and distinguished career both with government as well as with non-governmental organisations working in the Asia Pacific, and he will be bringing forward very much how the donors and can support this area of localisation. Neil Bunye is the Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator for Pakistan, as well as the Resident Representative for the United Nations Development Programme. Neil has fulfilled this function also in Sri Lanka, as well as a variety of other places, including on the Chernobyl emergency. And Neil has over 30 years of experience that he will be sharing his insights in terms of the Pakistan context. So we are privileged to have these speakers. I would again encourage you to use this opportunity to put your questions forward. Please do use the question and answer facility as well as the chat function, which again is on the right-hand side of your screen. So as we move to really jump straight into it, I'd like to first go to Gwendolyn. Gwen. I mean, from your perspective as an actor, particularly from the Filipino Red Cross perspective, what does it mean in practice to have national and local actors at the centre of humanitarian response? Practically, what does this mean for those on the ground? What does it mean to those around you?
Well, thank you very much, Ingrid. But I believe that the key to humanitarian effectiveness is to focus on local actors, because local actors are, if you make them the center of humanitarian action, we can achieve more and we can do it better. But we have to first recognize that the national and local actors' role and their importance on one hand, and we also have to empower them to play a stronger role on the other hand. Unfortunately, the local actors are not yet empowered to play the strong role, and but this is a change that is on its way, and all we have to do, especially in the international community, is to support this change and make it happen. And also, let me share with you some of the key points why national and local actors must be placed at the center of our humanitarian work. Well, number one, because it is sustainable and predictable. It gives us sustainability and predictable response, especially before, during, and after a disaster, because they are part of the community. And also, national and local actors are already there. They have been there first to respond. They can respond quickly, and they are in the better position to respond, especially if they are, if there are trained volunteers or volunteer groups in the area. And when international actors leave, the local actors continue the work on the ground, especially if humanitarian response is already linked with long-term recovery. This is very important because local actors can make lasting difference in the lives of the most vulnerable. Then also we have to look into the preparedness side when we work with local actors. They are prepared because it's already part of the local system. Of course, the level of preparedness may vary or differ from one place to another, from one country to another, but at least we can start somewhere because there's something already happening. And like in the Philippines, there are the local actors are part of and understand the government cluster system. They have the trust and working relationship with the government and local stakeholders. That's why they can respond quickly without taking over. And because of that, as I've said, it's part of their system. There are already like actual work done, like prepositioning of goods, training, there are drills, policies, the standardization in place, maybe organization of response group or rescue group or volunteer groups. So there are already a lot of work done in that part. Then local actors also know the context. They have local knowledge. They know the needs. They know they know the priorities, and they can tell us, you know, what are the gaps and what else do they need. They have strong understanding of how to work, and also they know the different actors and communities, including community acceptance and culture and norms. That's why it's very important to work with that. And also, local actors are accountable to the public or its own public or population, because some of the local actors, or not, if not most of them, they are mandated by law to respond to disaster, especially, of course, the government. And local actors have the connections to communities, which has allowed quick, relevant, and targeted response based on what the affected people need or want. Also, it brings the benefit of understanding the feedback mechanism of the communities. And this local action is really now working in the Philippines. So that is, you know, my point of view, why we have to put, you know, local actors and national actors at the center of our work.
Thank you very much, Gwendolyn. I think that you covered very well the reasons why the local and national actors should be at the centre. I want to now turn to Jamie, who, for you as a donor, Jamie, what does localisation look like, and what does it mean in practice for you? Tangibly, what does this practice look like?
Ingrid, thanks. Look, I think from my perspective, what it fundamentally looks like is that responses to humanitarian crises are as locally owned and implemented as possible. And that means fundamentally that affected communities are not simply beneficiaries, but actively involved in determining the priorities and allocation of resources. That assistance that may be coming from the outside is complemented or aligned with the efforts and assessments determined by local communities, local governments, local actors. So I think that's fundamentally what, from our perspective, what it means to for localisation in response to humanitarian crises. I think the reality, though, at times is that it's going to be very different in different types of crises. In some situations with sudden onset crises where there's significant capacity on the ground and government and NGO ability, then that ability to mobilise that effectively can be done quickly, and international support can align within that. In other situations, in conflict situations, that can be more difficult, but the principle of localisation is should still very much be the central driver to how we're thinking about our response. For us, it's also ensuring that the linkages between risk reduction, preparedness, and recovery is being considered and taken in a collective way. That investments and funding as a donor to organisations isn't siloed in terms of just simply providing funding for a crisis, which doesn't then link to the recovery priorities and hence obviously back into investments in preparedness. I think for us it also means an inclusive approach. Localisation means it's not simply working through one actor or one sector. It's engaging local government, civil society organisations, affected communities, private sector. But it's also inclusive in terms of within that, that for example, that women are not only simply a part of community that are consulted, but are actually determining priorities and in positions of leadership in crises. That people with disabilities or vulnerable communities are also an active part of shaping and determining a response. And the final point I'd just say is, I guess, on the linkage between local, regional, international efforts, that from our perspective, what we would be seeing as a localized response is the principle of subsidiarity, that primarily that the invest focus is on what can be done locally, but what is overwhelmed on that the regional or international efforts are then complementing or supporting that local effort rather than overwhelming it.
Great, thanks very much, Jamie. I think that was an excellent outline from the perspective of a donor. I want to now go to Neil, who, as a humanitarian coordinator, that role performs an essential and critical function within the international system. And so for you, Neil, what does localization mean in practice, and for you as a humanitarian coordinator, and how have you taken this forward in practice in terms of Pakistan? We'll get onto the concrete steps later, but it would be really good if you could provide a bit of a tangible perspective from your side about the practical realities of this.
Yeah, thanks, Ingrid. I mean, localization fundamentally means better results, reaching more people sooner and for a longer lasting benefit. But to do that, it's a bit complex because there's many dimensions to localization. There's the work with government at different levels. There's work with civil society. There's the relationship between local actors or among local actors. There's how local actors interact with international partners and the best way that international partners can facilitate, which Jamie was just talking about. And then also the way that the humanitarian country team, which I lead, can best collectively really create an atmosphere for localization. So more specifically in Pakistan, what it's meant is that we've provided, especially since 2010 when you had the major floods in Pakistan, much more support for national and local government in preparedness and response, both for government counterparts and for local stakeholders, and using actually both tools from the humanitarian part of our work as well as development projects related to disaster risk reduction. But it also means direct support for national civil society organizations and actually training them in how to work in our systems, amongst other things. And there we've reached 1,160 people from 48 sessions that we've had around the country. But it also means investing in strengthening relations with government and local civil society counterparts, because if, in some sense, government can't really operate an effective local response only through government, although often a lot can be done, but they need to have civil society partners, and civil society can't really operate in an atmosphere that's not conducive where the government isn't being supportive. So using things like the World Humanitarian Summit, where we encouraged a common Pakistan presentation, and other things, we've tried to bring civil society and government together in practical ways. Then it's also very important that international organizations, especially when a new emergency is coming on and they need to respond quickly, have a bit of a code of conduct that they don't poach staff from national and local organizations. Going back before Pakistan to when I was in Sri Lanka, that was a big issue, for example, when the tsunami hit. And essentially all the local organizations were decapacitated as big organizations came in and had to respond and spend the resources that they had. And it really put things backward later when I was working on issues of response to the conflict. Then finally, I think things like giving voice to local actors. So in Pakistan, we've had an international NGO group called the Pakistan Humanitarian Partners Group. And partly as a spin-off from that, there was something called the National Humanitarian Network that's come together that is essentially a voice for national civil society within the humanitarian community, both with the UN agencies and the international NGOs, but also with the government. So those are a few of the things that we're doing. Ingrid, over to you.
Thanks very much, Neil. I'd like to now go back to Gwen. I mean, Gwen, you provided us with a very useful outline in terms of how you see localization working in practice, what you see as being the benefits, both in terms of accountability and in terms of sustainability and some of the other areas. What I'd really like to do is take it now to what concrete steps have been taken in the Philippines to promote localization. If you could elaborate or illustrate for us and for the audience what type of concrete steps have been put in place that have been able to make a difference there.
Thank you, Ingrid. Okay, so what we have done so far, like in the Red Cross, Red Crescent national societies, especially with the Philippine Red Cross, we have presence in 102 strategic places in the country. We have designed a structure that we can have, our presence in every corner so that we can respond quickly and work closely with the local government and local stakeholders. Our strength is our volunteers, so that's why we invest so much in volunteer development. We continue to build a culture of volunteerism in the community that we serve, so that we can have, people who can help themselves, not just be helped, but also making them resilient by empowering them also. Then we conduct constant training, not just to our staff members, but also to local stakeholders, and invest so much in building the development of existing local capacities. Now, another step that we took is we have invested strongly in preparedness before, during, and after a disaster in all disaster continuum. Because Red Cross always work with the government and private sector through cluster, to agree on coordination and establish contingency plan or disaster management plan. This is also good to already identify or determine the roles and responsibilities before a disaster will strike. Now, we also do joint planning with the local government, joint training, pre-positioning of goods, and we share this information to, partners or other players so that they know what we have, so that we will avoid duplication or overlapping of responsibilities. We have also set up our own disaster relief emergency fund, that in case of emergency, we have fund that we can utilize right away, so we can deploy, in the fastest means, our response. We collaborate strongly with private sector on how we can best use their services in times of disasters, because we know that the private sectors have a lot of resources to share or give. Then we strongly support the government in the implementation of the disaster risk reduction law because we believe that this law is a law that's localizing humanitarian action. So we conduct workshops and seminars because many people do not know that in that law, that the local government can utilize calamity funds that can be used not just during calamity, but also during preparedness. So this kind of things is, helping also the government and other actors to localize, to promote, localization in the country. Then we also put in place memorandum of agreement. So we agree beforehand or before disaster strikes on, who is supposed to do what. We spell out clearly the responsibilities and commitment of each party. Somehow it is binding because it's, an agreement. And we continue to review and revise this, as necessary or as needed. Then to guide our work, it is very important that we have a strategic plan and operational plan in place, and that we enjoy the trust and confidence of our partners. We also have policies in place, like the anti-fraud and corruption policies. We make sure that we follow the SPHERE standard. So we also have books of standards so that we maintain quality in our work. We are accountable and create impact in whatever we do. And then we have put in place also strong monitoring systems. So we have this kind of thing in place just to make sure that, you know, we get the trust of international partners or actors for us as local partner to deliver our work in the Philippines. Then we engage with established community disaster management committees in the local in the local places for assessment and accountability, and also for us to be able to integrate our work together and collaborate. Because if we, you know, don't use these groups or committees, we will not be able to harmonize or integrate our work. Then we also ensure that investment is made to local actors. In the whole Red Cross, Red Crescent now, we make sure that, you know, there's quality money in whatever we do or spend, especially when we are investing. So we are talking about investment funds. This should support long-term, sustainable programs at the national society level. So we have the National Society Investment Fund and also the 1 Billion Coalition. So those are the things that we are doing. Now, to give you a practical example of how it really works on the ground, for example, Typhoon Haiyan. When the typhoon struck us, everything was so chaotic. So the local government do not know what to do. All the partners are jumping into Tacloban City. Tacloban City, by the way, is the hardest hit area during the Typhoon Haiyan. So there's so much media attention given to Tacloban. So there's so many actors who went there and provided support. It did not happen in the very beginning, but because of the experience, the local actor, the local government learned that they must, you know, be in the driver's seat, that they must be in charge or take charge. So they opened a registration of all the actors who went there in Tacloban to register who will do what and where. This will ensure that there's a harmony in what we do. We follow the plan of the government, then we are accountable what we're doing. When we promise, it has to be delivered. So there's a way also validating it. It also promotes integration of the work of the different actors in the area. So it helped a lot also to organize. So it somehow have helped in the coordination of all the humanitarian action. It wasn't perfect because there were some actors who did not, you know, go through that, who did not follow, but at least the system was put in place because of that experience. So yeah, those are the things that I would like to share and the practical steps that we have done in the Philippines and in the Red Cross Red Crescent movement. So thank you very much, Ingrid. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Gwen. It's great to get a bit of flesh on the bones in terms of really understanding practically the steps that have been put in place, and also referring to Haiyan, which for many of us, we were engaged in that, which we saw some of the truly good parts of the local response, but also some of the challenges in terms of how the international, national, and local work together. I'd like to move to Jamie now, and Jamie, from your perspective in terms of the donor, it would be interesting to hear what concrete steps you have been putting in place from Australia's perspective in terms of promoting localisation, and as Gwen has done, to really provide us with some tangible examples that we can take forward with the discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Ingrid. And thanks, Gwendolyn, for your very practical sort of sharings and experiences from the Philippines. So, look, from a donor's perspective, but maybe to touch on a few things that Australia's tried to, or that we're either putting in place or are looking at how we can try and better support the localisation agenda in different types of crises. I think one of them obviously is the issue around how we better we shift the current approach that too often is occurring in the way international donors, communities, agencies respond to crises, where it becomes a more supply-driven response rather than a demand-driven one. And what we mean by that is that there's still a very blunt instrument to how international assistance is activated or mobilised to support a response, particularly to sudden onset crises. And it's a sort of a blunt off or on switch. And when it's turned on, then it often triggers large and significant mobilisations of relief stores flying in, of health teams going in, of urban search and rescue teams, etc. going in. And the challenge with a lot of that is it's often not necessarily resources that have been specifically requested or are going to most effectively align with what local communities, responders are needing, and with a lot of that resources going in, it very quickly overwhelms local response efforts, local logistical capabilities, ports, airports, etc. So one of the things that we're looking at is how we can work with our partners, and particularly in the Pacific, where we have a fairly active role in supporting neighbouring countries respond to crises, is how we develop a menu of options, a portal where before a crisis like now, countries have got an idea of what resources are available within the region, which Australia may be able to provide in terms of health, relief efforts, engineering capabilities, logistical resources. Similarly for New Zealand and other countries in the Pacific that may also be in a position to offer their expertise or resources. And the point there being that when before a crisis, countries have a better understanding of what they can specifically request, and when a crisis occurs, they can, rather than putting a generic request out for assistance, they can, in a much more targeted way, identify what resources assistance may be required and how that links into their efforts. And in response to Cyclone Winston in Fiji, that was fundamentally how that, Australia and New Zealand and France, to an extent, offered support, was giving an idea of what was available, and then Fiji requesting that in a graduated way as they got clearer as to what was needed. A second issue is looking at how we engage with the private sector in a much more nuanced way. I think we've historically had very general ways that we look at how we engage with the private sector. We talk about the importance of working with private sector, but we're not often very clear about what is it that private sector in different situations can actually bring to the table. How do we actually effectively mobilise that? And how do we, as a donor, not necessarily see ourselves in the role of funding things, but sometimes facilitating or allowing the different partners or relations to come together? And a couple of quick examples of what we're doing on that is looking at how we can work with the insurance sector to look at ways that they can provide low-cost insurance to small businesses and households in the Pacific who are going to be affected by crises in an ongoing way. And it's looking at a very different model, which is delivered through mobile technologies. It's often low cost, and the payout is not that large, but it comes at a very critical time to support businesses and households. We're working with banks to look at how we allow for much more reducing the overhead charges of foreign remittances and exchanges that can be so critical in supporting countries responding to crises. And the last area which we've been active involved is we launched what was called the Pacific Humanitarian Challenge. It was a challenge where we basically put out to partners within or globally to look at how we could solve a number of specific challenges that communities and countries in the Pacific had identified as a constraint. And I won't go through the range of issues we identified and who the winners were, but one thing I would flag is one of the winners in a partnership was with the Australian Red Cross, and how they were going to be developing a database of local businesses in Fiji, Vanuatu, and Solomon Islands, who before a crisis we knew what their capabilities, what their potential reach is, and how humanitarian agencies, donors, and even obviously local governments could quickly activate and draw on them to be part of a response. because they've often been very marginalised in disasters because of the agencies and donors go to what they know, which is often international mechanisms, international businesses, and bring them in and often sideline that local capacity. So I might stop there, Ingrid.
Thank you, Jamie. I think you brought forward some really excellent examples, including a really important one, which is around the role of the private sector. And I can see on the chat that we're getting quite a lot on the private sector as a body. But I'd also like to encourage, we've already received quite a few questions, but please feel free to submit your questions. We will be turning to Neil now, but straight after that, we will be opening up to the audience and putting those questions to the speaker. So it's a great opportunity to put those through now. So Neil, following up on Gwen and Jamie's examples, it'd be good if you could also talk about the practical steps that have been taken in Pakistan and by yourself and the Humanitarian Country team to put localization into practice.
Yeah, great examples and some inspiring stories from Gwen and Jamie. Putting things into action, I think it's also important to realize that there's a lot of challenges in doing that. One of the biggest ones is the traditional way in which international agencies have worked, which has often been to use local organizations purely as partners, which is a sort of localization, but as some of the questions have pointed out, localization is more than simply being partners. Another challenge is that because we need to meet fairly complicated requirements from taxpayers and donors and auditors, often our internal procedures become so complicated that you need to have a PhD in internal procedures to understand them, and that's a disincentive for local partners. And then often the different roles of local partners within a country aren't always easy. That's less of a case in natural disaster situations and more of a case in conflict. But nonetheless, this relation between the national government and civil society can make it complicated for an international partner to engage. And then, of course, there's issues sometimes of transparency and how organizations report. There's risk management issues, and sometimes it's difficult to manage for an international donor, for example, to manage risks in a local organization, harder than, say, with some international partners or UN. And of course, there's the issue of different capacities. And the fact that we also don't have many models enough for working for the private sector, even though the private sector is the one who often first responds. But we have some good practice here, and I'll just go quickly through them. Going back to the huge earthquake that affected areas of Kashmir and the Kagan Valley in Pakistan in 2005, Oxfam had a long relationship with local NGOs, and when the earthquake happened, they wanted to put those local NGOs forward first, but they also had some difficulty vis-a-vis their headquarters in London, which said it's very important with all this money coming in from individuals that we can track it, that the risk is mitigated of working through partners that we don't know. And so what Oxfam did was, in effect, embed Oxfam staff within very capable national NGOs. So this ensured some transfer of knowledge. It ensured some element of risk management. It ensured some help with reporting, and ultimately also meant that the local organizations were able to provide better services to people faster and more sustainably. Second example is the 2010 huge floods in Pakistan. And I think it was recognized from that a lot of things could have been done better by international organizations. There was not enough engagement with local partners. And so there was a big push to build the capacities of the National Disaster Management Authority, which had been led by General Nadim, who's fairly well known, and also the provincial disaster management authorities. So work by the humanitarian side on emergency preparedness, development projects on building capacities, work on reducing risks from disasters. We actually seconded staff inside to these national organizations. And I think most importantly, it wasn't done as a 6-month project. It wasn't done as a 2-month response. This is an activity that's been carrying on with deep partnerships over 6 years since 2010. And I think that's had a big impact. The third element is the use of our pooled fund. We have tried to have almost 100% of our funding through the pooled fund go through national organizations. We've not quite managed that. It's been between 87% and 100% over the last years, but pretty close. And to do that, we've included training of national NGOs as part of the objective of the pooled fund. How best to design a project, how best to apply, how best to monitor it. And this made sense for us because we're often working with this fund in difficult parts of the country. These people know the communities best. They have better access than other people do, and they stay with the community, when the project is finished. So this has resulted in, I think, very good results in very difficult parts of the country by basically using our pooled fund to invest in national capability. Over to you, Ingrid.
Thank you, Neil. I think that you actually brought in an aspect that's actually come up in one of the questions, which is the role of funding structures and mechanisms and how local actors can get better access to direct and larger institutional funding. So I think that was an excellent point to bring forward. I'd like to, we're now going to open up to the panel from some of the questions that have come from you. And just a reminder that really some of the issues that have come out strongly is the issue of preparedness, the issue of context relevance, accountability to effective population, the use of incentives such as innovation funds, menus for local and national actors to provide predictability, and to move from a supply-driven to a demand-driven approach, the issue of risk management, and this is a double-edged sword, as many of the questions have been highlighting, as well as funding, and of course the role of the private sector. And I think this is quite critical. First of all, I'd like to go to the speakers, and here we've received quite a few questions about the issue of risk management, and this is going to the heart of some of the issue of localization, that sometimes there can be a perception or there can be a concern that local actors have more risks entailed, or the potential for more corruption, or the potential for more financial or accounting irregularities, and I think that this is whether it's a perception or a reality needs to be tested. But Gwen, you touched a bit on this in your presentation in terms of what the Red Cross and the Red Crescent has been doing, and particularly the Philippine Red Cross has done in terms of putting in place procedures and accountability mechanisms yourselves. What I think would be interesting is if you could talk also about what you've seen from other local actors, or how this could be replicated more broadly to address some of these concerns, and how this could be supported from different actors to ensure that there is the standards that need to be put in place, and we can move to more focus in terms of having a shared risk management approach. Over to you, Gwen.
Thank you very much, Ingrid. Well, if we talk about risk, corruption, fraud, all of these things, well, number one, I think when we partner, we must start with, genuine intention. Why we partner, why we will work on a partnership together. Both parties must be honest. Both parties must respect each other. Both parties must trust each other. Then, because it is not just only on the local actors, but both actors, can, or possibly, if there is no mechanism in place, there's a big risk. If we like to see, especially on the part of the local actors, to be professional and trustworthy, they must demonstrate what we know are factors for success. So what are these? A deep understanding of the situation, smart implementation with quick feedback, strong financial management, accountability and collaboration, as well as the ability to not just implement projects, but also to engage in wider public issues. And we must invest more and invest smartly in local actors' capacity development. It is not just about one laptop that we give them. It's not about sending them to a training. It is really about striving for their maximum accountability and transparency. So there must be a pre-agreed, policies in place that each party, both parties must respect and follow. So this is really not just accountability and transparency, but also integrity issue. There must be a strong integrity on both actors or both parties. So if we make sure that we support them in this and we carefully guide them, I'm sure we can reduce the risk. So because many local actors are very new, they lack the skill, maybe they lack the technical knowledge. So if we guide them, work side by side with them, and really have a transfer of knowledge and technology, then we can perhaps resolve and mitigate the risk factors. Thank you, Ingrid.
Thank you very much. I'd like to actually, Jamie, to put this to you as well, because in terms of Lemire, we have a question from Lemire, and he's put forward, why do donors feel that it's harder to manage risk with local organisations than with the international organisations? I mean, we're all aware of various scandals that have been in place, particularly around procurement and other areas. So it'd be interesting to hear from your perspective as a donor, is it true that you see it as being easier to work with internationals or not, and what is being put in place to try and address this perceived imbalance, if it is an imbalance? Over to you, Jamie.
Thanks, Ingrid. Look, I think it's a very fair question. I mean, at one level, I think there's no easy answer to the issue about how you get the balance right between managing, risk and accountabilities, which are important for all the reasons we know, but also ensuring that it's not being driven through an overly bureaucratic, siloed, potentially Western sort of approach to accountability, which I think has often been the experience for many local organisations in the past. I think for us, one of the constraints fundamentally, to be honest, is the relationships and knowledge. And we talk about being context-specific, long-term investments in relationships and knowledge of the situation and who's got capacity access networks on the ground. And I think we need to be realistic that from a donor's perspective, there's only so much an extent we're able to do that. I mean, we do have embassies or posts in countries. They have a broad range of mandates, priorities, agendas that they're delivering on. And so it's difficult for us, or in the reality is that we're not in a position to really have an in-depth, or in many countries at least, unable to have the in-depth and day-to-day understanding, networks, relationships in place to be able to very directly and confidently invest and support in local actors. Having said that, I think that's why we then need to look at how do we partner more effectively with international NGOs, the UN, or common pool funds that allow us to sort of say, well, we don't ourselves need to have that day-to-day network relationship and confidence, but there are mechanisms here which we can influence and advocate on, which can deliver us that level of confidence and allow funding and support to go to local organisations and networks in a much more direct way. And I think there's a challenge there if we're going to be able to do that as a donor, that those that international NGOs have got those right relationships in place, that they're not just simply another level in the sort of delivery chain, but they're actually a genuine partner. In the model Neil talked about, where Oxfam seconded people in really, rather than adding the layer, but partnered with them in that response, is probably a good example of that. But I think from our perspective, I think that's the main constraint, but it's not a reason for why we can't do it. And I think that's why we've got to continually look at the types of mechanisms and relationships which we can have, which can, as much as possible, incentivise and support that local agenda.
Thank you, Jamie. I want to now move to the issue of accountability to affected populations. We've received quite a lot of input on the chat and also in terms of the questions about this area, particularly the issue of how to ensure an impartial response when some local partners may only be representing the interests of certain parts of affected populations, or they may be affiliated to political elites or the conflicting parties, or being used by a tool of the authorities, or at least being perceived to be in that way. So I really want to, and from an accountability perspective, this can often come up in the area of women, which Jamie has already touched on, or people with disabilities who may be excluded from either receiving support or having that feedback mechanism or being engaged properly. So I want to go to Neil on this one and ask you, Neil, in terms of accountability to affected population, and particularly in terms of ensuring an impartial response, what more can be done in this area? How can we practically deal with some of these concerns around how to maintain the impartiality of the response with local actors, or is this a legitimate concern or not?
Yeah, well, I think it is a legitimate concern in some circumstances. If you have, in a conflict situation, it's often hard for local actors to be completely neutral, either because of their own beliefs or because the framework within the country makes it hard for them to be neutral. And even in circumstances after something like a tsunami or an earthquake or a terrible flood, there's often different political pressures on it. So there's really, I think, no completely easy answer to it. But one of the key things, and I think Gwendolyn talked about this, is actually having good preparedness and good capacity, actually having worked with a lot of local partners for a while, and from an international perspective or a UN perspective, knowing which are the local partners who are following those principles and who are more likely to be able to be accountable to results. And then in terms of accountability to affected populations, perhaps that's one way to ensure that the local organizations, are walking the talk that they're supposed to. And again, some of it comes down to preparedness, some of it comes down to monitoring of the organizations. When I worked as a humanitarian coordinator in Sri Lanka some years ago, that was a huge issue in such a hypercharged environment. And generally what we did as an international partner, recognizing that local partners often were better able to do it, was really work with organizations that we had worked with for quite a long time, and which we knew were reputable, and had partnered with things, for example, like Oxfam in the past. But we always were coming under pressure to help organizations that had perhaps a political agenda, and we basically would not fund those, and we'd find alternatives. And in some cases, it meant actually working through international partners, which we otherwise wouldn't have, but we thought that it was more important in that case to maintain neutrality, to reach the people well with the assistance they needed, than necessarily go with a local partner who wasn't capable. Over.
Thanks very much, Neil. And Gwen, I'd also like to take this question to you. Another way of looking at this is what's come from one of the audience is the issue of duty of care, and the use of local actors sometimes is perceived as being outsourcing a duty of care when an environment may be insecure. It'd be interesting to hear from your perspective, particularly given the importance for the movement of volunteers and the fact that you do work in a variety of different situations, about whether you have good examples about how to maintain that duty of care, and also your perspective on this accountability to affected populations, about whether it is, whether there also are good examples of having that strong accountability link as Neil put forward.
We cannot control.
When we can hear you, go ahead, please.
You can hear us because I cannot unmute my mic. So anyway,
yes, we can hear you.
All right, thank you. Well, looking into that about how we ensure accountability and that how we are going to make sure also that there is a strong respect of duty of care. Say in the Red Cross, you know, there's a great deal of efforts that we have to do to make sure that we depoliticize, you know, the local partners, even, you know, the people that we serve. It shall have a humanitarian agenda above anything else. So, like us in the Red Cross, the International Society have a strong statute and legal grounds in the form of a law to minimize the risk of corruption because of maybe link with government or, you know, other groups. You know, what we do is we also involve the local community. So we do not go to the community with a concrete plan. We go there with, you know, an intention to support and help them. For us to be, you know, well accountable is that we involve them. We make sure that they know they're part of the decision making, they're part of the process, not just the government, but including the beneficiaries themselves. So this is very important to us so that they know who will get what. Oftentimes we receive a lot of complaints like, why am I not receiving a house? You know, and, you know, someone in the community received a house. So if you involve the community, you set the criteria together with them. They know the people in the community. They know who lost everything. They know who still have something. And we can only give to the most vulnerable because funds are hard to come by. We cannot give to all. So if they understand that, we can minimize, we can make sure that, you know, we are accountable to the beneficiary.
Okay, we seem to have lost Gwen there. I think she was, though, covering some really important points in terms of practically about the community knowledge, the community linkages, and the accountability of people to the community when they're from the community in terms of that area. So I think we captured that point well. I would like to now go to Jamie. One of the issues that also has come up a little bit is this issue of the role of the media. And there's often a lot of pressure on organizations to be seen to be responding, to be seen to be on the front line, and a concern that this can push the international actors to take a more of a leading role when they should be more of a supporting role. So from your side, it'd be interesting to hear about how where you see the role of the media fitting in. Can we deal with that role better? And what could be put in place to really enhance the media to promote localization and to tell that story differently?
Thanks, Ingrid. Look, I think this is a very real issue. The influence, obviously, that the media can have, both positively and at times negatively, in shaping a response. You know, the media often has their at times story or narrative almost written before a disaster occurs. You know, with the ability to quickly get photos, quickly get stories out, and that sort of natural sort of bent of the media to sort of put the more extreme aspect of it can lead to this sort of messages getting out that nothing's being done, people are not being assisted, the international community needs to respond, and I think it can be a very it doesn't reflect the efforts of local communities. It doesn't understand the context that's on the ground, but the impact of it is that very quickly, you know, donors, big humanitarian agencies, NGOs are suddenly getting pressured to be responding to this media pressure, and with that demonstrating how they are making a direct response to that. And that then leads to this problem at times where the international efforts overwhelm and sideline local efforts. I think the two things that we can be trying to do a bit more on this, one of them is looking at ways that we can tell a more collective story to our ministers, to our boards, to our funders, etc., that about how we're part of a supporting an effective response, how we're engaging and aligning our efforts with local responders, and that we're not sort of trying to overly claim what we're doing and how we're resolving and solving the crisis. So I think then there's a need for a greater humbleness and a more collective message rather than what we are doing, which is always difficult in a competitive environment, but I think we need to resist it if we're going to ensure local efforts are acknowledged and supported. The second issue, I think, is looking at how we can engage the media in understanding the localisation agenda in a more effective way, that they're able to tell that story and communicate it in a more meaningful way, both through footage and stories. But I think they're probably the two. Again, no easy answer, Ingrid, but they're probably the two of the ways that I think we need to start looking at a more collective approach to how we engage the media.
Okay, thank you, Jamie. Just for everyone who's on this webinar, I'd just like to alert you that now in the right-hand corner, you'll see that we have a closing poll. The poll, as discussed at the beginning, is a really good opportunity for us to be able to collect information and to collect your input in terms of how we can improve these webinars going forward, in terms of what may be useful on this issue. So I'd really encourage you to please fill in that poll. It takes about 30 seconds, and it's really valuable information for us. And this is also to highlight that we have 15 minutes to go before we'll be finishing this discussion. So I'd like to go now to Neil on a bit of a different issue. This is how we talk about the area of collective leadership and collective engagement. There's often pressure to increase diversity and inclusivity within HCTs, whilst at the same time, as we all know, there's a lot of increasing pressure in terms of prioritizing, being seen to do or to actually do quick delivery, and to make decisions. Sometimes these two trends don't always work well together. They can contradict each other, and often this can be at the detriment of or the disadvantage of having local and national actors engaging in HCTs. Now, you discussed having the national NGO consortium there. One of the speakers one of the participants has said, is that enough for us? Do we need more than just having one NGO or one consortium member that represents all the national NGO? So how have you tried to balance this need for inclusivity, but also with the rapid time management? And is it as contradictory as sometimes it's made out, or could we be doing things better to try and deal with this pressure?
Yeah, I think you've actually hit the point there, Ingrid, that inclusivity doesn't necessarily mean slower response or difficulty in prioritization, because if you have the right people on representing the diversity of positions in the country, and if you also have the right people who are involved from an international perspective with some people who bring in, for example, the Philippines experience, as well as what might be coming from Europe, it's going to make your team work better. The trick is ensuring that the people who are involved either have that PhD in procedures that I talked about earlier, or they have the procedures are done in a way and the discussion is done in a way that actually includes them, because it can be profoundly disempowering if you come into a discussion where an awful lot of jargon is bundled around or is very focused on sort of abstract concepts. Whereas if you include people on the substance of the issue, you don't necessarily need to have people who have these PhDs in humanitarian coordination. You can have people who just know how to get the work done on the ground. But again, I come back to this thing that it's very important to have some degree of preparedness. It's more, you need to have more than just one consortium at the humanitarian country team, but you need to have involvement in the clusters, where clusters are there, in the strategic planning that's done. Again, I go back to in Sri Lanka, where we also tried to make sure that our role would ensure that national NGOs had a voice when we were dialoguing as a team with ambassadors, when we were dialoguing with ministers, when we were putting together larger plans in the country. And that was a huge advantage. I mean, it opened doors for me that otherwise wouldn't have been there as humanitarian coordinator. So it's not necessarily a dilemma. It can be an advantage. You just have to have some, some good preparation and some engagement. And if you do, it will work. Sorry for the long answer.
No, it was. Thanks, Neil. That was really. I think it was really useful to bring forward what you did. I'd also like to highlight for the audience that we've had a really interesting discussion in the chat. So Fiona and Linda Potiet has put forward the issue of twinning programs and how in Afghanistan, particularly with Akbar, there's some really positive examples in terms of how NGOs and national NGOs have been working together on this whole area of twinning programs. So if you go and have a look at the chat, they've actually put a link in there that you can follow to look at those examples. So now I'd like to go back to Gwendolyn. The discussion of the private sector, we had Jamie touch on that. There's been quite a lot of discussion in the chat about the role of the private sector. One of the audience members would like to know whether you can elaborate a little bit more on how practically the private sector has been brought into the clusters or HCTs. How have you engaged with the private sector and made it work and linked it to the different systems and the different ways of working that we you have, and to really bring forward that local response and enhance that local response. Over to you, Gwen.
Thank you, Ingrid. As what I have said earlier, that the private sector, has a lot of resources, and we must know what resources we should map out. Who is interested in this field and what they have, and if there is a real interest to humanitarian action, and they should be willing to do the work and also have the expertise. Sometimes the concern and problem is that there's so much willingness on the part of the private sector, but they do not have the expertise. So what we can do is to assure them, assist them, help them to understand and improve also their technical knowledge and skills, that they'll be able, because if they understand more the context of where we are in the field that we're working, we can get more from them. So so we have to harness that skill. We have to improve that. And the role of the private sector in disaster management is really multifaceted and multidisciplinary one. In defining, assigning, and implementing clear and coherent institutional roles, in training, maybe equipping and achieving proficiency and effective response capacity for the high-risk communities, because they are there in the communities and they have the resources, so we can make use of them, in engaging them in supporting the communities to better prepare. In the Philippines, there's a private sector group that was formed, and they have a seat in the National Disaster Risk Reduction Council. So they are very much engaged, involved in what we're doing. Although, as I've said, they are very new in this field. What is nice here is that this field is developing. So we have to continue help develop them to keep the momentum, to keep the interest, because sometimes they are lost somewhere, especially if there's no disaster. So we need the private sector. Their role is not just, during disaster, but even before and after is very important and very crucial, because they can help a lot in before and after as well. But you can see a lot of private sectors coming in, pouring a lot of money, giving a lot of human resource support at the height of a disaster. So we have to, also look into the before and after emergency, in which area they can help. And they can help in assessing institutional needs, like developing and implementing programs to assist key organizations with sustainability issues and measures, because they all have the expertise on how to manage well in an organization. They have the corporate know-how, corporate knowledge, so they can help that, especially in finances, in putting systems in place. They can help us in that. They can also improve disaster consciousness of the general population, because many of the private sector, they own big TV radio and media networks that they can help disseminate information. So we can use them. They can, to the best interest of the people that we serve. In improving access to accurate information and basic communication, energy, water system for high-risk communities, we can facilitate, appropriate technology alternatives, with the support of the private sector. There's so many examples that I can give. I can just continue talking about how private sector can really help us, but they, I believe, can play a big role in the humanitarian, action. And it's just that we have to, get them, engage them, get them more involved, build better relationships with them, and really know, their real motive in, humanitarian work. Thank you, Ingrid.
Thank you very much, Gwen. I think that that's a bit of a call to action about the fact that we may need to do a little bit more on the role of the private sector and how we can work with them better. So I'd like to give just to say that we are now in the last 5 minutes, so that poll is still there. Please do fill it in. It's really helpful. I'd just like to go for the final point to Jamie. Jamie, the issue of training, there's been some questions around that. There's a lot of discussion about capacity building and training. We often hear this. One of the concerns is that what does this mean in practice, and how sustainable is it? We all know the stories about people going on repeated training, having high turnover of staff. There not really being a sustainability in terms of maintaining that knowledge within organisations or within a response. So how have you as a donor gone about trying to deal with this issue of training with the different local and national actors and make it sustainable?
Thanks, Ingrid. Look, just 2 points on this. One of them I would say is that, look, I think training is one of those difficult issues that, it's how long's, how far can you stretch a rubber band? What's enough, what's not enough. My view on it is that it's the need to constantly ensure that the training that's being delivered is relevant to the context, the environment that local actors or humanitarian agencies are responding to, that it's drawing on lessons learned from recent crises and constantly sort of really challenging people to think about how the principles of humanitarian action are principles of humanitarian response are put into action. And the other view just on the training, I think, is that sometimes we look at it too much as an organisation or as a sector. And the frankness is, yes, that people may do training, they may move on to other things, but they're also going to often move into other roles that are also going to be important in terms of ensuring the overall effectiveness, inclusivity of responses. Training that might be provided to people, for example, in the Red Cross Society, they may move into government, and that in itself is a very positive thing. So I do believe training is very critical. The issue is ensuring that it's as relevant as it should to the principles we're trying to take forward. Just in terms of our experience as Australia, one of the things that we've really tried to take forward in the Pacific is looking at how any training that's delivered on humanitarian preparedness and response is coupled with a workplace support or mentoring component, so that people are not, the on-the-job learning, as we know, is as important, if not more important, than formal training. And so we've really tried to couple together formal training that Australia may support through our NGO partners or the National Disaster Management Organisations or with our Red Cross partners, with a mentoring or twinning arrangement where people then go back into their environment, are being supported and engaged in a day-to-day way as to how that training becomes relevant to their operations.
Thank you very much for that, Jamie. That provided some really tangible examples for us. Well, I'd like to say that we're now drawing to a close. So thank you to everybody in the audience, particularly those of you who sent through some fantastic questions and engaged on the chat. I would encourage people to have a look at some of the links that have been put there. They're incredibly useful. Just to say that the webinar recording will be available on our website. We'll also be circulating and sharing the PowerPoint and the summary. Remember that there is the closing poll there. I'd also really like to say thank you to our speakers. Just so you know that Jamie is actually sitting in Australia at the moment, possibly in his pajamas, doing this with us because it is extremely late in Australia. So your dedication to the cause of localization is impressive. And also for Dr. Pang, you are sitting in Beijing, which isn't far off in terms of that time zone. So it's been really great to have you committed to doing this with us at the state, and also to Neil for your examples and your experience that you've shared with us. So thank you very much to our presenters today for all the knowledge that you've put forward. I'd also like to highlight that we have a new website as the state, and encourage you to have a look at it. It's very new. We're very open to receiving feedback, your ideas, your suggestions. We will be putting up the material from today there. It's at www.deliveraidbetter.org. It's on your screen at the moment. Please click through. Thank you very much. Have a good day.